To the Deep Dive Spirituality Conversations podcast. I'm your host, Brian Russell, and it's my privilege today to welcome back for the third time Amos Smith. Amos Smith is a writer and a contemplative thinker. Amos is here to talk about his 10th anniversary edition of his classic book, Healing the Divide, Recovering Christianity's Mystic Roots. You're going to love this conversation. Amos has a unique way of describing the interior life that I find rare. He's able to actually describe the experience of silence. He's also theologically adept and psychologically trained, and so you'll hear a lot of really good information today that I know blessed my soul, and I learned a lot. I also talked to Amos about his approach to writing, which I believe you'll find helpful if you are a person who tries to create content. Before I jump into the conversation, I want to remind you, if you'd like to reach out to me, you can check out my website, Brian Russell PhD. I'm pleased to announce that there is now a free course available there on how centering prayer can help you grow spiritually. You can check that out. I'll put a link in the notes wherever you're listening to this podcast, and also there will be Amazon links to all of the resources. If you do click through on Amazon, these are affiliate links, and I get, without causing you any increase in your payments, a little bonus from Amazon. It's a way that you can support the show, and even if you don't want the books and you buy stuff on Amazon regularly, would you please consider using one of the links for your purchases? Without further ado, let's jump into my conversation with Amos Smith. Welcome back to the Deep Dive Spirituality podcast. Amos, it's great to see you.
Thanks, Brian. Good to be here. Appreciate your work.
Well, thank you. And we're here to talk about something really exciting. It's your 10th anniversary edition of Healing the Divide, Recovering Christianity's Mystic Roots. I love the title. Let's jump into this in kind of two ways. I mean, it's the 10th anniversary, so I'd love for you to go back and kind of share what led you to write the original version of Healing the Divide, and then, come and take it 10 years to today, and what's changed, what's different? Is the book still, do you still have the sense of same purpose that you started with? So just kind of talk about how you wrote this book originally, and what's brought you to do a 10th anniversary today.
Yeah, well, to kind of go about it, circuitously, words are inherently dualistic. As soon as you say anything, you can say something that negates what has just been said, or something that affirms what has just been said. So that is why mystics, through the ages, they hesitate to use words, and they usually prefer not to use words, because it just really doesn't help to understand the experience any better. So we have to find, however hampered the effort may be, we have to find words that point to the experience in deep silent prayer. And many have referred to this experience as non-dual. And I, in hindsight, I wrote this book 10 years ago, but I really needed to have a non-dual theology in my own tradition that I could really own, and that would anchor me in the experiences that I was having in deep silent prayer. And so the Jesus paradox, which is what this book is about, Healing the Divide, is really about finding that non-dual tradition within Christianity. We don't need to go to some other religion. It's right there in Christian tradition, and it's kind of hidden in plain sight, you might say, because I think Cyril of Alexandria put it best. He said, Jesus is at once God and human. He is both creator with a capital C and creature with a lowercase c. He is both divine with a capital D and human with a lowercase h. He is both eternal and temporal. And And why is this so important? It's because if we see him holistically and we see him as he is, as a dynamic unity, which is what the center of the tradition and I think the mystical fulcrum of Christology is, or the theology of the Jesus paradox, then we begin to have a better potential of reconciling the contradictions within ourselves. Because all human beings I have encountered, including myself, are contradictory people. There's numerous contradictions in life. But if we have a center, which is a dynamic unity, and if that is our focus of devotion, and that's our core, and that's what we find when we go into deep states of prayer, then we can better, integrate all the different contradictions within ourselves. And I think there's so many things about ourselves that we tend to hide and suppress and deny and avoid. And if we can reconcile those things within ourselves, we're going to be much more integrated people. And unfortunately, the Christian right, most that I encounter, they're comfortable with Jesus as divine with a capital D, as God, period. They're not really comfortable with the humanity. At least many that I talk to. And then on the other end, the Christian left, they're comfortable with Jesus as a wisdom teacher, as a human being. They're not really comfortable with divinity with a capital D, or God, the God aspect of Jesus. But I really think that both are missing the point, that both positions are truncated. Both positions are, they're reductionist, because what the mystics tell us, like Athanasius and Cyril of Alexandria, and Severus of Antioch, they tell us that Jesus is at once God and human. That means you cannot speak of him as divine with a capital D without also speaking of the humanity with a lowercase h. They are always, one is one side of the coin, the other is the other side of the coin. You cannot have one without the other. That is the fulcrum of Christian tradition. That is the fulcrum of Christian mysticism, and that is our non-dual theology for the West. I'm being just slightly long-winded here, but one other thing to keep in mind is that the theology of the Trinity is the same. It uses the same Greek words, which I won't go into here, but that the Trinity is both one and three at the same time, and it's the same language that's used in the Greek for both. And really, for the Orthodox, these are the two great mysteries of the faith: the Trinity and the incarnation. These are the core. And so if we get this theology right, we have some chance of really understanding the depth of the tradition. If we don't get this theology right, we're kind of lost. And my favorite analogy for the Trinity is H2O, because H2O can be solid, it can be ice, it can be fluid, it can be water, it can be gaseous like steam, and it all depends on the temperature, but it's all H2O. That to me is really what the Trinity is about, is you have so much more power because you have these different skillful means, these different forms. And that's what, is carved out all of these glaciers and carved out the Grand Canyon, because it's got these three distinct forms, but it's all H2O. And so, and my favorite analogy, and I'll end with this, when it comes to the incarnation, is one time Athanasius was asked, he said, how is, the Son, that is, Jesus, how is the Son equal to God? And what Athanasius said, which I think is so brilliant, is he said, as sight is equal to the eye. So sight is this spacious, broad vision that we have. You could say God, but it needs an incarnate focal point. It needs a lens in order to see, and that embodiment, that physical aspect of that vision is the eyeball. Without the eyeball, you would not have the vision. And so that's what it is with Jesus, is that you have this incarnation, and because of this incarnation, we can now see the vision of God in its in its complexity and its completeness. And so that's the beauty of this theology to me, the non-dual, mystical theology for the West.
Right. Yeah, thank you. And just to be clear, I think it was implicit in your answer, but if somebody's listening and maybe they're a new listener to the podcast, can you just define a little bit what does non-duality mean? What does non-dual mean? And then also like what does it mean to be a mystic?
Well, so most people are that they're really especially in our times, Brian, most people are are polarized, and our politics are polarized, and we take one end of the spectrum or the other as like a tug of war, and we just start pulling on one end or the other. But what the mystics are saying is, hey, take a step back and think about the tension that's in the rope itself, that in the middle of that rope, there's this tension, and it's this creative tension. It doesn't have to be gridlock. There's this creative tension there. And I think, we see that creative tension in the Gospels. For example, I think my favorite example is so one day when Jesus is having a bad day, he curses the fig tree. Now, to me, that's a very human thing to do. That's what I would do on a bad day, is I would curse a fig tree. I mean, that's just, that's what I would do. But then you find, a little bit later in the gospel that there's so much power and energy around his body and his robe, that a woman who has been hemorrhaging for years comes up and touches the hem of his garment, and she comes away healed. She comes away whole, because of that healing energy which he exudes. And that seems to be the center upon which the Gospels are built. And most people, if they have anything to say about Jesus, that he was a healer. But we have these two aspects, and they're in creative tension throughout the Gospels. And so that to me is being able to reconcile that creative tension is a lot about what non-dual is. One analogy I'll end with this, which might help understand this non-dual perspective, is that there's two daughters, and they're fighting over an orange, and they fight over it so much that they actually start pushing each other and slapping each other. Mom finally comes and intervenes and says, okay, Felicity and Fiona, why are you fighting over this orange? And Mom, in her wisdom, asks some clarifying questions like, Felicity, what do you want from this orange? Well, it turns out Felicity wants the peel of the orange so that she can make orange peel tea, and Fiona wants the flesh of the orange. So Mom, says, hey, there's no need for this conflict. There's no need for this, fight, because, you can both have what you want. The one wants the peel, the other wants the flesh. There's no problem anymore. But that's what I think the non-dual approach does, is it helps us to solve next level problems, which is what we're going to need in this world, because we can't solve these problems, these complex problems that are presented to our world today, with a dualistic mind. It's just not, it's not something we can do. We can build a bridge with a dualistic mind. We can have successful surgeries with a dualistic mind. There's so many things we can do with a dualistic mind, but to get to the next level, I think we're going to need to think creatively, to be able to step back and to find some other a possibility than the usual butting heads and gridlock and like the two daughters fighting over this orange. And maybe one last example from the Gospels is, Jesus is caught in this mob scene where there's a whole bunch of men who are going to stone a woman, and and the thing that most people would do is just take the side of these men. And Moses said, in the law, that if a woman commits adultery, that she's stoned according to the Hebrew scriptures. But they come to him and they said, well, what would you have us do? And I think the amazing thing is that Jesus has the wherewithal to step back from this mob scene, and I mean, I would never have that kind of wherewithal. I mean, I would get caught into the vacuum and into the energy of that mob scene, because that's what mobs do. They pull you in and just get you polarized. And but Jesus somehow had the strength and of mind and the wherewithal to step back, and he starts doodling in the sand. And and then it comes to him when he just pauses. And I think that's what a lot of what non-dual is about. Don't get caught up in the frenzy. Don't take sides. Just step back and say, okay, I'm going to quiet myself and see what happens. And then this amazing insight comes to Jesus, and he says, he who is without sin cast the first stone. I mean, what an amazing insight that's the essence of non-dual. You don't get caught in that polarity, in that dualistic quagmire. You find some creative solution within it, and then afterwards he goes to the woman. He says, don't do this anymore. Just don't, leave this life of adultery, and you're better than that. So that's a non-dual approach, and Jesus, naturally brings that often. Um, there it is.
That's a fantastic example and reading of that text. So I want to thank you for that. That just actually brought that to fresh life for me. So that really resonated. I know the listeners are going to love what you just shared. Well, talk about centering prayer. Again, you're known for teaching that. I've had you on to talk about it, but why after so many years of practicing, are you still passionate about it, and why do you think it's so important today?
Well, I think, to put it most essentially, I think most people in today's world, they do not know how to relax. Now, when they say that they're relaxing, it's quasi relaxation. They don't really know how to deeply relax. And in this world, with all of its curveballs and all of its polarization and climate change and all of the political issues that are facing us internationally, and COVID, and suicides, and mental health issues on the rise. And I mean, there's just so many different angles, so many different challenges and problems, and most people don't have the bandwidth to deal with it. And I think a big part of the reason they don't have that bandwidth is because they don't know how to deeply relax. Now, there are going to be people who they're going to seek ways of relaxation which are irresponsible, and so for self-soothing, they're going to turn to alcohol. They're going to turn to substance abuse. Marijuana is much more prevalent now, and a lot of people are turning to marijuana. I was looking at an article the other day, and the numbers are constantly going up of people who rely on marijuana to relax. And then there's other people who they'll do running or jogging and yoga, reading, artwork, various ways of relaxation, maybe some psychoanalysis, some therapy. All of these things have a benefit, but they don't go deep enough, because what any massage therapist will tell you is that every single body that they work on is riddled with tension. There's all kinds of tension all throughout the muscles, all throughout the body. And people will ask, okay, so what's the source of all this tension in the muscles? And teachers like Thomas Keating and others, and there's a great book out there called "The Body Keeps the Score," and it's about all of the tension in our muscles. And so some of it is, when we're growing up, we have the garden variety traumas, like for example, maybe getting lost in the mall, and the kid gets lost in the mall for an hour and is freaked out, traumatized, feels abandoned, and so on. That experience of trauma is recorded in the muscles, and that's what The Body Keeps the Score, that book talks about. And then, of course, other children have unspeakable traumas that are also recorded in the muscles of the body. So somehow we need a way to release all that tension that's in the body. And just as if you are overexerting, you have sweat glands, which allow your body to cool and to sweat. And you also have, if you have any kind of um, issues with allergies, you might have, your nasal passages will help your body evacuate whatever allergens are in your system. Well, in the same way, if you go deep enough in centering prayer, like people like me who've been doing it for over 10 years, what'll start to happen in centering prayer, and it doesn't take 10 years. For some people, maybe a year, maybe even less, but you get into such a deep place of relaxation. It's much deeper than sleep. And this gives the body permission to start releasing tensions in the muscles. And in the centering prayer community, this is referred to unloading. And so what will happen, and this is just an example, one time I was sitting in meditation and silent prayer, centering prayer, and all of a sudden I started having stabbing pains in my abdomen. And it's right about where I had a hernia operation when I was a kid. But the stabbing pains, it got to such a point where the pain was excruciating. I had to stop the centering prayer and just do deep breathing just to get through it. But what started to happen, kind of like a Charlie horse, is it was just spasming and a lot of pain. But I breathed through it, and after about 2 or 3 minutes, there was this extraordinary release where all of that tension in my abdomen, it was just causing me so much discomfort. It all just released, and I felt this feeling of just catharsis. It felt so good. And there are other centering practitioners that I've talked to, who've had the same experience. It's not unique. So it's something that is within the body's capacity of releasing tension, like other mechanisms, sweat glands and tear ducts and so on. The body has this mechanism of releasing this tension, and that's what we need. Especially in the 21st century, we need this deep relaxation that's much deeper than all this other stuff, and that really helps people to be able to find their deep source, their deep center. That's what's going to help us in the 21st century, because people just don't have that capacity, and then they don't have the resources to deal with challenges when they come up. A tragic example is a friend of mine who I knew for years, and he was raised in a single parent home by his mother, and he was very successful, but when his wife left him, he just wasn't able to keep it together, and so he was on a business trip in Bangkok in Thailand, and he took a run off of a skyscraper. He committed suicide, and it's because he didn't have the resources. He didn't have the ability to get into a place within himself that is solid no matter what's going on, that is relaxed in a much deeper sense than most people understand. So that is why I'm passionate about centering prayer, because it can do that for us. It can help us to to heal the nervous system, and to release all this tension in the body.
Yeah, let me follow up, because you gave a really interesting answer, and thanks for sharing about the personal thing with the stabbing pains in your abdomen. So when I'm going to ask this, like when that was happening, at what point? And I'm not sure if you answered this already, because I was I was trying to listen to the story, but did you connect that to your hernia operation in the moment, or was that in like after the fact? And then my bigger question is, we don't always talk about this, but sometimes when you do centering prayer, you will actually relive sort of traumatic experiences, which can be difficult. So, like, talk a little bit about at what point did you realize what the pain was from, and then I think if you're a therapist, and so if somebody's in centering prayer and something really upsetting, traumatic, bad memory kind of shows up, because we don't always talk about this, that can be really discomforting for a person. So, like, what is your experience on that? Because a lot of times you talked about addictions, people cover. I mean, this, people cover up pain with alcohol, drugs, or whatever, work, all kinds of stuff. So when we get still, that is the healing space, but it can be scary, existentially scary in the moment sometimes. So what's your wisdom on that, Amos?
Well, I like what Thomas Keating said. He always had these practical ways of talking about these, deep subjects. And he said, when you're taking out the garbage, he said you don't you don't sort through it and say, okay, these are banana peels over here, these are some cans, and over here you've got some lettuce and some beans. I mean, you just throw it all out. That's what you do. You don't sort through it. And he said that you really should do the same thing when it comes to unloading. Just whatever the tension that comes up, just let it go. Now, sometimes you might have an intuition as to what the source of that trauma is. Now, in the case of the stabbing pain, that's some of the most intense pain I've ever had. And I'm sure it was related to my surgery, my hernia surgery, because I have the scar. I still have the scars there. And I was, how old was I when that happened? I was, I think, 5 years old when I had the hernia. But that is how this unloading works, is that sometimes you will go way back to, because in the body keeps the score. That's what they talk about, is that these tensions, some of them are from when you're a toddler, when you're a kid, something that happened to you, maybe your parents didn't even know about. You slid down the steps when they weren't looking, and they just thought you were crying, but you had this insecurity ever since about going downstairs, or whatever it might be. But yeah, I think generally speaking, it's not really skillful to try to go through and sort out where these various tensions are coming from. But sometimes the insight will be there, for like the hernia operation, for example.
Okay. Yeah. It's funny. I've talked about this on the podcast. I had a hernia operation when I was 20 months old, and I had this really scary memory, and it's literally, I've always had it in my head, but in the centering prayer, it got really, really vivid, and it was actually super healing because I felt abandoned from my parents, because I was like, I had this memory of being trapped, and it was just a split, and I was in the centering prayer actually brought it up, and it's just been the last couple of years, and I actually, my hypervigilant mode has actually turned down, just to give a little testimony about what you're talking about, but it took silence and 50 years after it happened to just get it out. So it is, and so everything what you said just completely resonated. So saying,
Yeah,
so thank you. Yeah.
and Brian, there are some therapies available out there that do get to that deep level, because I think what we're talking about here is kind of like a glacier, and so you see the top of the glacier, but underneath there's like this massive expanse that we don't see. And that's all of our history, of the body keeps the score. It's all the history of those garden variety traumas that every kid experiences throughout their childhood, that basically just get stored in muscle tension in the body. And there are some therapies that address it besides meditation, centering prayer, silent prayer. For example, Rolfing. Rolfing is one method of massage that goes really deep into the tissue, the muscle tissue where that tension is localized. So Rolfing can really be effective. There's also somatic yoga. I mean, somatic yoga gets into that deeper level, but these other, I'm not saying these other therapies are not necessary, or whatever. I know they have their therapeutic value, but they're kind of like dealing with the visible part of the iceberg. They don't get into the deep nervous system and muscle tissue tension that people carry around. And I'm so much easier to be around, so much easier to live with now than I was 25 years ago, because I've let go of so much of that tension in my body. And it's just that's why I wish it for other people, that they could experience the same thing. I asked Thomas Keating about it one time. I said, so after, because he's been doing Seminary prayer for I think 40 years. And I said, what is it like doing Seminary prayer for that long? And he said life just becomes effortless.
Mm.
There's just no longer the resistance. There's no longer any tension there. It's just kind of a sense of freedom and effortlessness. And I thought, that's pretty cool.
No, it's good. It's good. And I will say, you've referred to The Body Keeps the Score, and again, that's one of my favorite books. And I've heard, anybody that's listening, especially pastors, I think it's a book that really gets you in touch with kind of what like what Amos is saying, right under the iceberg. So thanks for bringing that to our attention again. Well, let's get back to your book again, 10th anniversary edition. I mean, and so that I think it's really exciting. Talk about what's different about the new version of Healing the Divide over against the way that you edit it. So, and you can go in as much detail as you want. But what are some of the shifts that you made in the book that makes it even better than it was originally?
Yeah, well, thanks, Brian. Yeah, so first, in my first book, the citations were not up to par.
Mm.
And so I just had some professional help, and I got all the citations to an academic standard. So the citations are just much more clear and much better organized, and corrected, because there were some errors there also. And then I also, in the first book, I didn't mention the two main people, when you think of patristics, or when you think of the real fathers, who were the source of this non-dual theology. I didn't talk about them as much, and that's Cyril of Alexandria and Severus of Antioch. So I went into more detail about them in the 10th anniversary edition. And then the first book was redundant. I just noticed, years later after I wrote it, that I really did kind of repeat some things over and over again. And so I cleared out the redundancy, really streamlined the text, so it's much easier to read. And I also kind of emphasize in this 10th anniversary edition that the Jesus paradox is really the West's non-dual theology. I really think that that's what this book is. Like, if I had to summarize it in just a few words, it's introducing the non-dual theology of the Orthodox tradition, Oriental Orthodox in particular, to the West. This idea of that Jesus is at once God and human. And there's a lot to that, and you'd have to go into the book to to get into it. But I also finally just want to thank Whip&Stock, publishers, for the 10th anniversary edition. I appreciate them doing that, um, and I'm excited about it. I'm also open to any kind of communication people have. If they want to be in touch with me, my email is amossmi@gmail.com. So that's 7 letters, amossmi@gmail.com. And I enjoy corresponding with people about the books, and being in touch with readers. So yeah, let me know what you think.
Yeah, and just to build on that before I'll put everything in the show notes. You just gave your email. What's your website if people want to connect with you on your website?
Yeah, it's rcmr5.org. You can also get there just amossmith.org.
Okay.
And there is a password to get into the website, and the password is friends. It's all lowercase, just FRIENDS, friends. And that'll get you in there.
Yeah, that's great. Well, talk a little bit about, just so people can get to the roots to the book. You've done a lot on with the early patristics, especially the Desert Fathers around Alexandria. What actually What drew you to them? And can you just talk a little bit about how your practice of centering prayer actually led you back to some of the very roots and what that was like for you?
Well, the Desert Fathers and Mothers, I think they needed a theology that was big enough for the experience that they were having in silence. And they found that in the Miaphysite theology. Miaphysite is a Greek word, and it means one dynamic nature, basically. And that's how the desert mystics understood the tradition, is that they would get into these deep silences that were deeper than words, and that there were a mystery with a capital M, and they just rested in that silence and in that mystery. But then when they went into their normal lives, they had a word for that experience, and it was Jesus. They also had a liturgy for that experience, and they had the Psalms that they read, and they had their other devotions, and so it was all an integrated life. And it's the idea that really there are two aspects of mind. There's absolute and there's relative. Now, most of us are very familiar with relative state of mind because we live it every day, and it's also connected to the senses. We have that amazing, muffins that my spouse made, and I'm thrilled because they're so good, and strawberry muffins, and they come straight out of the oven, and there's that experience of satisfaction when I'm eating those muffins, but then they disappear, and they are no more, and then there's a feeling of somewhat of loss and deprivation that what I had I no longer have. And that's all just wound up with the senses of taste and sight and hearing. And that's why I think in the Gospels, in Matthew 6:6, Jesus says, "Go into your room and close the door." Now, this was a metaphor because there was no room that you could close the door in those times. There was just two big rooms in most homes, and so there wasn't a room that you could go to. But I think the metaphor is to close the door to the senses, and then another world becomes possible when you shut the door to all the other senses. And the Orthodox refer to this as the what's the word they use? They use is it divine intellect or spiritual intellect, something like that. But there's a capacity within the mind to understand a deeper level of reality, which we would call absolute. Or we could use that word, and it's that there's no words for it, and I think most people thirst for it, but to understand that there's those two aspects of mind, one that's tied to the senses and that's relative, and one that is not tied to the senses and which is deeper, and transcends and includes everything else, and ultimately it's about intimacy with God, experiences of God's self, and those are more satisfying, and more profound than what we find in relative existence. And it also energizes our relative existence when we do experience that absolute level of consciousness. So I don't know if that answers the question, but that's yeah. Anyway, that's that.
No, I think it does. Let me ask you a couple questions about just writing. You're a very good writer. And what's your writing process? You've now produced several books, including relaunch or re putting back out the book that we're talking about here, Healing the Divide. But what's your writing process for you, and how did you learn to become a writer?
Well, thanks, Brian. I think writing is it's so powerful on many different levels, and I think ultimately how I would describe myself is not necessarily a writer, but a scribbler. I'm just always scribbling notes down, and there have been some scientific research that has shown the activity in the brain, and when you speak a thought, you have certain kind of activity in the brain. But when you speak a thought and write it at the same time, the activity in the brain doubles. So there's something about putting a pen in your hand and writing something down that increases the brain activity, increases the possibility that you're going to remember this, and it also helps, I think, with clarification. So I think scribbling is something that I've always done. And I'm influenced by the writer Anne Lamott. And Anne Lamott, she said that really what you should do when you sit down to write is set aside a period of time that you're going to write, and just put anything that comes into your head and basically turn off the editor. I think that's the problem a lot of people have with writing, is they don't turn off the editor, and they want their first draft to be perfect. It's never going to be perfect. And Anne Lamott actually refers to it as the shitty first draft. It's always going to be that way. No matter how good of a writer you are, your first draft is going to be shitty every time. And so just puke whatever you got in your head onto that paper. It's going to be shitty, it's going to be ugly, but just get it out there and turn off your editor. And if your editor tries to intervene and say, hey, you got to use Grammarly, and that's not grammatically correct, and I think you got that spelling wrong, just say, shut up, editor. This is what I'm doing right now. I'm just doing, I'm just getting it all out on paper. And that's what you got to do, to really start, is just put whatever is in your head onto paper, and don't try to edit it. The editing comes later, not for the first draft. The first draft, you turn off your editor, you shut down the editor, and all you do is just get it on paper.
And do you literally, because you're a scribbler, do you literally write by hand? At least sometimes? Is that what you meant by that, or do you just do it in little bits and pieces on it, like
well, so I have this stack of 3x5 cards.
Yeah, I like
and I carry those around with me, and they're like all over the house, and I've got a stack of them here. One of them says to do, and the other one says article ideas, and the other one says big picture notes, and sometimes I just find it easier to grab a 3x5, and if I have, because life is fast paced in the 21st century, right? And you can do it in the phone also. I just got in the habit of 3x5s a long time ago, but I keep a lot of notes in my phone. But yeah, I mean, sometimes I'm scribbling on 3x5, sometimes I'm just inputting in the phone. But one way or another, just have a way to honor your thoughts instead of just discarding them, like pausing for a second. Oh, hey, that was a pretty good thought. I don't want to forget that, right? And then just writing it down, like either in your phone or a 3x5 or whatever. And then you never know later on what it's going to turn into. And that's the genesis of these books also, is they started out as just ideas that I scribbled down in rough form, one way or another.
Yeah, just one last question, because I'm resonating with what you do. Actually, if I'm looking at my desk, and like I have for those on the video, it's like I use the same thing. I use 4x6 cards. I guess I even have more to write down on cards, but my whole desk is piled with ideas and stuff, and use the journal. So I really resonate with what you just said. Now, on your nonfiction books, I mean, you get a lot of ideas. Do you have a bunch of ideas and then it turns into a book, or do you create an outline? Like how do you actually organize your writing once you know you're actually working on a book project?
Um, yeah, I mean, organization, when it comes to like the real broad brushstrokes, like the meta titles of the book, I'm good at that part, and I've helped other authors with their writing that way. When it comes to the really broad categories, like where you're going, like the rough kind of big outline kind of thing. But I'm not as good with the detail structure, of just the I guess all the subtitles and making sure that it all lines up perfectly, because that's not really the way I think. So I have used the strength of other authors when it comes to detailed organization, but I'm good at kind of the big picture, and I can help authors with that. But most of it, I think, is you want the writing to flow. You want it to be readable. You want it to be beautiful, and you want it to be an art. It shouldn't just be, I don't know, dry. It's got to be something that people are going to want to keep reading. So I think that's the essence of it.
That's good. Yeah, and the last question, like what's your next project here? Do you have any more books in you still, you think, Amos?
Well, I've moved more towards articles now, and so I think I'm going to be focusing more on articles, and I've got a feature article in Friends Journal that's coming out next month. Um, and I've got this other article that I'm working on called Deep Relaxation and Deep Resilience. Um, or I think I actually changed the title, Profound Relaxation and Resilience, that the two are related. And we talked about that earlier in our conversation, the importance of deep relaxation to be resilient in the 21st century. So yeah, I don't know where that article is going to go. I might send it to Weavings. I've thought about Weavings. I don't know if you've ever read Weavings, but they're really good Christian spirituality contemplation, and they put out fewer. I think they put out six publications per year. Anyway, so yeah, I think articles is more my speed now. I might do one more book. I'm thinking of Meister Eckhart. I really love Meister Eckhart, and I'd like to do my angle on Eckhart. So.
It sounds like I'd love to read that because he's definitely we hear a lot about him, but I think a really good book would be wonderful, especially through your lens. Well, I want to thank you for being my guest again. Again, everybody, this is Amos Smith, and do pick up if you haven't read it already, pick up the 10th anniversary copy of Healing the Divide: Recovering Christianity's Mystic Roots. Again, thanks for being my guest. I'm really grateful for how generous you are with your time and sharing your wisdom. And this was I mean, you spoke to my soul multiple times today, Amos. So thank you.
Well, Brian, I appreciate your work, and I think I've contributed blurbs anyway to your latest book, and thanks for your podcast. And I think the work that you're doing is really important. Just being able to make the Bible accessible, tangible, and a living, breathing, vital influence, instead of something from the dusty shelves of history. So people who try to make the Bible relevant, as you do as a professor, I have a lot of admiration for. So.
Well, thank you. And thank you, everyone, for listening all the way to the end of this week's episode of the Deep Dive Spirituality Conversations podcast. As we go our own ways, let's show up, pay attention, and know that God's got way more invested in everything than we do. Thanks again, Amos, and I hope to talk to you again soon.
Okay. Thanks, Brian.